Okay, so yeah, I am now the host of the meeting. Okay, so let's start today's meeting, and we do have a lot of items on the agenda. So we will go over one by one, and then trying to finalize the OAM spec 0.30 release, which is very close. Let me share my screen. Okay, so let's start from the application entity pull request. I saw that Daniel has updated the whole documentation based on feedback from Kevin as well as other folks. I also take a look at of the whole pull request. I think it's very close to release. I'm not sure if Kevin, you're good with this pull request. Can we merge that?
Yeah, I can approve it somewhere, explicitly if that's important.
Yeah, I think you can leave a comment like "look good to me."
All right.
Okay. Right. So in that case, we will quickly go over to next item. Next item is the other entities. I actually sent a few pull requests. There are mostly minor fixes needed to align the examples and schema in the spec documentation with our latest design. So if you look at today's master branch, which is the draft documentation of the next release, it's already aligned with the existing design. But I do also think there are some, the whole documentation need an overall review. So if you have anyone have any better ways to read all over this documentation, and please please definitely check what still need to be updated. There are some issues I personally found out, but I'm not very sure about the conclusion. So I just posted here for some discussion. The first is for the personas definition. In this release, which is suggested by Kevin, we actually add a, let me open the spec. We actually will use component providers as the description for the people who is in charge of the component definition. And for the other personas, it's the same. The application operators will assemble components, trace, define application, and deploy it. And the infrastructure operators will be responsible for the runtime infrastructure, the capabilities, the workloads available, the traits available. So it's the same. But for the component provider, there is an issue raised by the community. Also, actually, somebody is asking this in Slack, I think just yesterday. So who is the component provider? And because in previous release, we somehow saying that they are developers, but they are actually not the application developers. They are more like the component developers. So we do have some confusion like component developers as well as application developers. So essentially in the old model, there's no entity for developer, in my opinion, because developer just write code and then publish their code in Git repo, for example, and then trigger CI, and CI will generate a Docker image. That's all. That's the whole workflow developer need to care about. And after that, the application operator will deploy the application by assembling the components. The components are provided by component provider. They can be a software distributor. They can be your DevOps team. They can also be another developer. But again, that developer does not have to be the application developer himself. That's where the confusion comes from. That's why I'm actually trying to write this discussion. So do we want to have a clear separation, clear definition of what is component provider, or do we have some other better wording to say or we have better definition about the owner of the component? This is a discussion I want to raise in this meeting. Not sure if anyone has ideas or thoughts on this.
I didn't have time to read through the whole updated documentation, just that as a disclaimer. In our experience, when we talk with people, I think that having the keyword developer to actually be able to say like, okay, if I am trying to develop my own application, let's say, I'm not a huge organization, but more in the individual developer aspect, I think we should add at least an example, a comment or something like that. Like this could be this type of person.
Okay, but what's the responsibility for a developer in your context?
I think we have had like two different type of feedback for us. Like one of them is just the same as you describe it, which is a developer pushes code and doesn't even bother about how the container is built. So that is on another layer. But at the same time, if we want people adopting this, like individual developers or quite small teams at the very beginning, those people take care of also writing that Docker file and writing the whole component, let's say. So we have mixed feedback in that sense. Like some people say, like if the organization or the practices, the engineering practices are there, I think it matches like developer pushes code and the CI/CD pipeline will build all the rest of the stuff, and somebody will help with the template for the Docker file and things like that. But if we go also to support like individual developers, I think it's important to have an open door for them also.
I see your point. And there are also another suggestion that we can actually simplify the whole workflow. I mean, the personas. So basically only have two roles. The first role is platform team or platform engineers. So they were responsible for all the definitions, entities, and then the application team. The application team will be responsible for the application object. So the application team can include application developers and application operators. This is another feedback. It's more simple, but kind of not aligned with the existing entities. What do we think about that idea?
Well, me personally, I don't know if somebody wants to ship before.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't have a straight answer right now. I need to think about it. Like we have mixed feedback with people also having troubles identifying themselves in the spec. Like I am a DevOps guy. Where do I fit into this and things like that? So I don't have an answer right now for the
other this is what we're trying to avoid actually. So so the old model actually do not have any implication about the personas actually. So for example, anybody can become a component provider in this specification. That is what we're trying to figure out a better way to fix. For example, you mentioned a DevOps guy. A DevOps guy can do anything. They can be the component provider, they can be application operator, they can even be the infrastructure operator. But in any case, they can still benefit from the model because they are basically unrelated. I mean the person roles with the entities categories. And this is actually what I'm trying to figure out a way to fix. It has been existing for a long time. For example, the DevOps guys say, "Oh, we do not have application operator role," but actually, it's not required. So your DevOps guy can definitely deploy application, right? As long as he wants to deploy application, then he is the application operator. So we do want to find a way to fix it. That. I think it's actually either part. The hard part is the component provider role, because the goal of the specification is there is the assumption that there should be somebody or some organization who provide the components in your system. For example, your Kafka component should be definitely provided by Kafka team, either by Confluent or by some other guy from the community. So it's rare that your team will be responsible for Kafka. But that causes confusion in the whole model because somebody will say, okay, what about the software I'm writing? Do I have to maintain the component by myself? This is actually not answered yet in the specification, at least for now, which are all covered by the persona, which name is component provider.
I guess personally, I don't see where the ambiguity, the confusion is. So I'm struggling a little. You know, the component is either reusable or it's not, right? And you know, in your Kafka example, that would ideally be a reusable component, but certainly I can envision, you know, somebody really trying to put an application together that might have a couple of one-off components that will never get reused, right? In that case, it's, you know, somebody closer to the application operator that might be defining the, you know, the component definition, right? But just in order to avoid confusion, you know, anybody that provides a component definition is a component provider, whether that's a shared resource or an application-specific resource is just is a different concern, right?
I see. So you're stating that the component provider is more like a generic persona role, right? It's don't have to be tied with any entity. Just anybody who maintains a component definition, then he's a component provider, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I very concretely, that's sort of how I hold it in my head. Now,
yeah, this is correct. This is definitely correct.
Things might get weird as to where that gets located and stored, whether it's in a global space or, you know, like an application namespace. It causes confusion, but I would choose to ignore that part of the problem.
Right, it's actually not the yeah, it's not the where to store it, or is actually not in scope of specification. Do we mention that in spec?
Well, that's where some of the names, the sort of the weird optional namespacing came in, because we wanted to be able to reference these things from other places, right?
Yeah, we want to support that, but it's not it's just a, you know, feature I want to support.
Right, but it sort of cuts to the heart of the difference between a shared component and a bespoke component, right?
Yeah, we should support both, in my opinion.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now, this is a discussion I want to raise. We don't need to have concrete conclusions today, but if anybody have any other input regarding to the personas, or maybe we should delete this documentation because we just need to clarify the entities. It's also one of the idea. I'm also think about that. So maybe we can have offline discussion about how we describe the workflow. And the
right,
second,
what do you?
yeah,
I guess what is the reason for having personas defined? I mean, I see, you know, how we're perceiving, how we're planning on using this. You know, pretty much components are going to be built by people developing applications, and they're just kind of fitting them in. You know, I'm only using component definitions so that I can use the infrastructure, not so that they could be reused per se. So really the application, you know, there's technically an application provider who just so happens to have components.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it starts to get into these other things that, I mean, what do you plan on using a persona for? I mean, is there anywhere in the spec that says you need a list of, say, I mean, are you going to use this to say like, okay, if I have a component provider and, you know, the name, they have some key on my system, so they're allowed to make changes, or they're allowed to install things on my platform? I mean, is that the idea here, that like I give you a key as a component provider and you're trusted to me, and therefore you're allowed to put those in? Is that what you plan on using personas for?
So yeah, I think Brian, you mentioned a very, very important question. The reason we introduced persona in this documentation is just trying to clarify the workflow in a typical OAM-based platform. So we do not have actually a requirement that, for example, as a component provider, you actually have some privilege or you actually have some unique responsibility. It's actually not the case. That's why I mentioned maybe we can try to avoid this persona work introduction, but in that case, we will be. I also, the only issue will be it's hard for us to describe the workflow of using our own platform, or we can just use an, you know, more generic workflow. For example, Alice and Bob, right? Alice provided components, Bob is deploy application. So yeah, that is the reason we introduced a persona. Just try to, you can look at the documentation here. We just try to describe the workflow of using this platform.
Right, but I guess I also see it as, Bob's deploying an application that has a bunch of components. One of
Yes.
these used to, already exist, but 3 I'm bringing along. But ultimately, Bob is trying to deploy an application,
Yes.
not components. He's just bringing components along.
Yes, that is expected workflow. So we really want to have the story that, okay, the user wants to deploy application, but in OAM platform, they have a lot of choices. They have available components to choose. They can bring their own components and assemble them into an application and attach chats. So that is the key workflow I want to describe. We lose the connection from Brian.
Nope, we got you. Yeah, if it's a point of confusion, maybe I agree with you, Harry. It's not adding a lot of value other than having a common vocabulary to discuss things with. So it certainly may not be worth putting in a specification anywhere.
Right, because I think it actually, by doing this, it seems like you limit what you really want people to do. I think that, it's much more flexible than you're trying to define here. When you put personas down into like ideas, like to just, actual, I guess I call them resources. So if you basically say a person really is tied to a resource, I actually don't think that that's correct. I think those resources they are what they are.
But that's, I mean, a role is tied to a resource, and a person can have many roles. It's not, all we're talking about is the roles, and he's calling them personas. It has nothing to do with who is operating in a given role or persona.
Right, but if I'm an application developer, I may use some components, I may develop some components.
That's right.
And I may, I think.
And you may operate in each of these roles that we're talking about.
Right.
But you're operating in a different role each time. But it's really not that important. So
yeah, it's really not important. So I think the idea here is maybe we want to delete this personas introduction. We just replace it with a workflow about how to use this platform. That's enough.
Makes much more sense.
So we'll say the person who provided the component instead of the component provider.
Yeah, we can summarize a little bit. So the person who provides the component is component provider. That's all. We just define a term because we want to use the term in the future specification. That's enough. But we do not need to introduce, okay, this is 3 roles must have, spec. That is what we're trying to avoid. So the idea is workflow come first. We have some summarize. For example, the component provider is the one who provided that component, and just like that, I think that will be more easier for people to get what is this workflow is basically about. Or even the reason we want to have this term is because we want to use the term in the future. For example, in the component definition documentation, we will mention that the component provider will be responsible for what. So that's why I think we can still have a definition here. Right, and it's also related to the component definition specification because I'm personally not very sure about what kind of definition we want to have in this terminology. For example, can we say that component is just an encapsulation of platform capabilities that could be deployed, or something other definition? So this part is open for discussion. In previous release, what we are claiming is that component is a deployable unit with the characteristic of the runtime workload. Do we want to keep this definition? Do you think it covers the idea behind the component? Or do you think there are also some something need to be updated for component definitions description itself.
And the word platform in that description sits uncomfortably with me, right? It's not the way.
You mean platform is not
a component isn't a platform capability. It's a, well, I mean, it depends on how you think about platform. It just doesn't line up with the way I think about it, but it might not be shared broadly.
You mean the term a platform may be, not confusing, right?
Well, yeah, certainly not totally defined, but I think you're going to find that everybody has their own perspective on where the line that divides the platform from the things above it, where that line is drawn, right?
In that case, we want to describe with the original description. It's more like the deployable unit, and which carries its workload runtime, the runtime characteristics of the runtime. That is the original definition. I'm thinking that it's partially accurate, at least. Okay, so these two terms are reasonable. I figure out that still need some discussion when I try to read the spec overall. For rest of the part, maybe there are still some not accurate part. It will be great if you can take overlook of the specification and raise issues and DPRs to get it fixed. More like we want to run a final pass or final review of the whole specification documentation. It has to be updated with the existing design for the spec fields and examples, so that part should be ready. But for the wording, for the sentences, for the definitions, it's basically carried or inherited from the original documentation. So that's why the next step will be a final review, the overall spec documentation. Okay, let's quickly wrap up to the next step. Is we are actively thinking what will be included in the next releases. And of course, in order to do that, we really need to have a clear goal of what's the next releases we'll target on. I mean, the core problem of OAM model need to solve. So right now, its goal is basically like a microservice application deployment model. So you have a model to deploy your application deployment, which are composed by multiple components. So if we keep this direction as our main target, then I can think of there are some missing features. For example, we cannot declare the topology of the microservices. We do have discussion about the feature which name is depends on. It has to be partially implemented in OAM Kubernetes runtime, but not yet in the spec, and the implementation itself also need to be upgraded to align with existing design. But it's also raised discussion like what we want to do regarding to that implementation, like if we want to integrate it with Argo workflow, something like that, or we want to reuse a existing implementation. That is an open discussion. But the core issue we want to bring up is whether we want to have depends on feature in OAM. What do you think? Not sure. Anybody have ideas about that? Of course, about the main question, what is the core problem the OAM model need to solve in the next releases? That is, I think, the critical problem we want to answer. If we think that the microservice application deployment is not the primary one issue. Now, this is discussion we want to have. Not sure anybody has idea on that.
So yeah, one question about this depends on. Is this about a component should exist, let's say, or be registered, or is about whether that component is healthy and deployed and is running?
So it depends on if there is a issue talking about that a long time ago. So it's basically about if a component, for example, you have MySQL component, you have application server component, and then you can define your application server component depends on the MySQL component. So in that case, the OAM implementation will ensure that the MySQL components will be provisioned and become running, and then to deploy your application server. So that is a currently discussion around the depends on.
Does this bleed into the, I mean, the stuff that Brian frequently raises around, endpoint injection? And I mean, there's two parts of that, right? One's wiring, the other's workflow, as you point out, and part of the workflow is health monitoring. But are you including the wiring part or not?
What is the wiring part?
Well, for your database, for example, how did the credentials for the connection get propagated?
Oh, I see. Yeah, that is the next thing, which name is service binding. I mean, how to consume data from the other component. So we try to separate the two things. First is dependency. Second is the data input output. Of course, in implementation they are related, but in the spec, I mean, in the UI, they are actually different things.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I think is missing is just, again, the ability. So you're running applications, but you have no idea. All you're really doing is consuming resources. You're consuming GPU, CPU, power. You have no idea why. And I think that's the, you talk about applications and things that you're running, but I can't really tell you anything about the application other than, my power, my hardware resources, things like that. I can't actually give you any more information. I mean, that's something that I'm, working around with the system, but I think that is something, that is really necessary, some way in the spec to tell you what my application does, and again, how to get data in, where the, once the application's running, where it's supposed to send data, even things like, I want to tell you where I want you to send your audit log, like just more knowledge about what's physically running. Am I running Bitcoin mining? Am I running, a porn site? Am I running, some kind of database? I mean, other than the name of it, you really don't know what it is. Is it some, North Korean hacking site that I'm deploying? I mean, I'd like to have some idea what's going on and be able to interact with it using the spec, that I don't have to basically use the spec to spin it up and then go somewhere else to control it.
Got it. Yeah, that is a valuable input. I'm not sure, Brian, are you able to write down this, your thinkings around this part in the issue? I think this is definitely one we want to fix in next releases. Maybe some part will become the spec, some part will be going to the implementation, but I think the direction here is exactly what we want to solve.
Sure. I mean, I could go in. Is this in that 447? Trying to think which.
Not all about that.
It?
I think you can create a new issue and reference this one.
So 231.
Yeah, you can create a new issue to reference this one. This one is basically about the dependency. I mean, the topology of the deployment, but you actually mentioned a lot of valuable things like, okay, how can we know where the data is stored? How can I consume that? It's actually also related with service binding we highlighted here. I think we can categorize this in the same issues. That is the interoperability about the data and the component and the full deployment. This is one thing the model definitely need to solve.
Sure, and again, we're doing this with traits and kind of came up with our own, class of trait. But then what I do is, and so I have to basically do that at an application level, even though it really is about the component. So yes. I've basically taken things that I'd like to put in a component, and I've move those to the application level, even though I really don't want to, just to make it work. So basically, each component almost in my case has to become its own application. I can't combine components together.
Yeah.
I basically combine applications together on your platform to create a bigger application, just because that's we're going to make it work that way. But I'd love to be able to, you know, kind of take some of the things that we've put down in an application and bring them back to the component, which is really where they belong.
Yes, exactly. So another idea regarding to this topic, Kevin or Daniel, you have any idea or want to bring up for the next release planning?
Well, if we're growing the list, one of the things we struggle with is the concept of application status. Like, there's no standard way for anybody to say, well, I provisioned an application, and without looking, there's just no standard way to know if the application's healthy.
I see. Yeah.
Right. So you really have to infer it from component statuses, which might be children of children, and
Kevin, I just answer a question here. Like, there's actually some way to pass the workload health status back to the application object. Like, it's there's a way that you can define, say, that's in the queue template. Say, this is the field to indicate the health status, and in the queue template, it will automatically check the field and report the status back into the application status.
I think Kevin is saying that we should have standard way to describe that in the application status. The queue actually enable that, but for the status structure, I think right now it's actually not defined in the spec or anywhere.
You mean like define? You mean the workload, or the workload have uniform status, or just a field in the application status saying, that's the place for health report?
My personal understanding, maybe Kevin can add after that, so is that we want to have the way to describe the application status in a unified way. For example, what is contained in the application status, and what should be exposed to the users to learn about that information. Is that right, Kevin?
Yeah, it's more about how is that information exposed, so that somebody that would claim to work on OAM compliant applications could work with an application containing any number of components of any type, right?
Right.
They should be able to be agnostic of those details and just say, I want to poll for the status of the app. Is it up or down?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I am talking about, the queue template describing the status. Maybe I can show the documentation.
But the point is, if two people had two different queue templates, they might report status in two different ways, right?
Right. But for one workload, like for example, for deployment, it has the status is defined in one one place. For example, it's the status of phase or status conditions, right? For another workload, for example, if I have a clone set or let's say my Pinterest service workload, right? Also in the spec, it's in a static place. So it's by CRD or by workload type.
Maybe you can paste a link which has this kind of information, so people can understand better about what you're talking about.
And I guess if we're continuing to grow a list, can we put security on the list?
Again, let me share in the depends on, underneath the depends on. Yeah. Wait.
You can share screen. I can stop there.
Yeah, I can. I will just paste it here. See my new paste. Or do you need to I can share my screen. Oh, actually, the host disabled participant screen sharing. Maybe Harry, you can still continue sharing the screen.
Okay, I'll share screen, and maybe you want to explain a little bit about this. Yeah, this status right back.
Right, yeah. So basically, like it's per in the component definition. If you look down or trade definition, it's actually like just scroll down a little bit. Yeah. So there's a health policy. So it's like of which definition, like or more specifically the CRD, it will check the fields, see the fields satisfy some kind of conditions. If it's satisfied, then it's considered healthy and will be reported back in the application resource.
Right. You mean this one?
Yeah. In the application resource like status, it will just show all the healthiness of all the components and traits.
So will this work without queue? Like if somebody uses a standard, let's say, queue template, that will also be populated based on the status of the deployments and things like that?
Yes. Yes. In the template, you actually define, in definition, you actually define what kind of status will be considered as healthy, right? So that status will be right back to the application status field. This is what already has been implemented in current code. I think what is missing is just all of these things are not part of this OAM spec right now, because the status field itself is not part of the spec.
Right.
All right, well, I mean, that's pretty close to what I'm asking for.
Yeah,
Every
I can
time-
understand that.
Every time we say, it's not part of the spec, it bothers me a little, but
We will like move this to spec.
Yeah, we can move that part to spec as well. The original reason we are hesitating with that because the status is a very Kubernetes specific field, because Kubernetes has some kind of concept like a key status. So we're struggling that whether we want to use key status or we want to have our own way. But I think the issue we're discussing here is not coupled with that issue, because we're basically saying how the application status what kind of information application status will carry is totally different. It's totally unrelated to the status field itself. It's more like a standard way of describing, okay, what kind of information should be carried as part of the application status. I think you can move that part in the specification, in the application entity. That is the direction I think we could go.
okay.
Yeah, I think it will also be a benefit. I mean, we are also struggling to try to infer these states to show in the web UI. So that would be great.
I mean,
Okay.
ideally, we'd like to get to red green, but I mean, this is in the right direction, right?
Okay, yeah, then we should have this one. But it's only just to claim that this will be going to the application entity as a status for that. So we do not have a concrete design for example, what should be included in the component status. I think it's currently we do not have a solution for that.
Well, yeah, it certainly can be the component definition, right? There is some kind of a component instance, and I guess you could talk about state there, but our status there. But I think it's most important at the application level.
Yeah, I agree. That's what I'm trying to confirm, that we will at least start from the application status. Yeah, there are some other features actually, for example, to define the status to make it work better. All of them actually, we can start from this implementation and then standardize it in the spec documentation. I will name it that as the application status. Where is it? Okay, so this, and put it in the next item for our releases. Okay. Besides that, any idea on the this I will call the metadata part of the OAM entities?
nothing other than we, tackling application scope is important.
Yeah,
But it's on the list.
application scope has already be highlighted here. We'll discuss it later. The other two things I added in this item is, first of all, how we handle the multi-cluster application distribution. So we do have some implementation to do that. I think they can be defined as the application scope in the future. For example, the placement rule. But that also, I think that we also need to have some way to handle the multi-cluster management, and it will be better if we can collaborate with some other project to do that. That is my current thinking, but it's of course no conclusion for now. But the fundamental issue is that, do we want to make that the OAM spec work with the multi-class deployment, or we want to have a separate entity to define the multi-cluster deployment? This is one issue I'd like to know how folks you're thinking about.
One quick question first. When you say multi-cluster application distribution, you mean deploying whole apps in different clusters or parts of the apps in different clusters? Yeah,
that's a good question. So right now, what I'm thinking is the whole application. So distribute the whole application to different clusters, because today you basically have OAM running in your runtime cluster, right? It's basically this kind of model. So if you think that we can move OAM at top of the multiple clusters, then we can actually have, for example, a placement scope to say where the application goes. This is a current model I'm thinking.
I think is a better place to start. I mean, we have been working in the past in the other model in previous companies. And once you try to connect the different components in between the different clusters, then the nightmare starts. So I will go with placing whole application at first, like not splitting the application in between different clusters.
You mean
just because?
Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
I will scope this as trying to, if I understood you correctly, this is like, I want to deploy this application in this particular cluster, like how I am saying, like deploying this in this and this and this, and things like that, but whole applications, like not a specific component of one application.
Yeah. So from my understanding that you also suggesting that in future we should be able to distribute components to different clusters. Do you think that is also the valid feature you want to support?
I think that the problem with that, I mean, the problem we had in the past in other companies we work with was how you build a reliable networking layer so that the components in between the different clusters can only see each other. And that gets tricky because, well, you need to define which is the mesh technology you want to work with, and it gets quite complicated quite rapidly. So we'll start initial iteration, which is like, okay, deploy a particular application in a particular cluster I have.
I see. Not sure what about Kevin thinking. I know that you folks are also working on a multi-cluster solution. So what do you expect from the OAM model regarding to that?
So that's complicated. I expect it'll be complicated. To answer one of your questions is, I think that at least sometimes the component would also need to get, the component resource will also need to be, created in the right cluster.
Okay.
Right, because if you have these notions of shared components and you have these notions of bespoke components, then you have to, you have to deal with the fact that you might have a component and application pair that are tightly coupled and move together, right? So that's one thing. The second is that we struggled with preventing the OAM runtime from acting upon an application in we'll call it the source cluster, right? So we have operators and such that know how to create a resource in a different cluster. but we had to sort of wrap all of the OAM resources in sort of a multi-cluster variant, so that they end up seeing its placement directive and say, okay, the OAM application resource that I need to create, I don't want to create it here, but I want to create it over in this cluster. So it's a modeling problem that gets caused by the not having any control over how effectively the cross-plane runtime, in our case, decides to act upon these resources, right? I'm not sure that I'm being clear at all, but how it gets modeled is of utmost importance. Whether it's, as you say, maybe an application scope, that's going to create a certain set of problems, and maybe there's another way, and there's sort of problems. It's a compromise solution any way you go, I think.
Right. Speaking of that, actually, Hongchao worked out a existing object which name is application deployment. So this is an independent object, but in this object, Hongchao actually added a placement rule. So you can actually describe whether this OAM application want to go to a certain cluster or what kind of selector they want to follow. Do you think this is a solution live with your user case?
This is similar to how we've done it, but
okay.
I haven't read much about this, so I would need to see how similar. But
okay, I will post it here. So basically, I think the question is whether we want to have this kind of object as part of OAM spec, right? Or we want to make it more like a application scope. So what kind of workflow and user experience we expect here? This is a question we have.
Yeah, exactly. I called it modeling, but how are these resources used to accomplish the goal?
Yes, that is what we are trying to figure out. Sure. Hongchao, maybe you want to add your comment regarding to this issue?
Sorry, who was that?
Hongchao. I mean, Hongchao. Yeah, he's working on this part.
Yeah, I originally write this part. So basically, this kind of thing, I think it works. It's better to group them together into the application resource. It's like one single entry for everything. Yeah, I think that's the correct direction to go to. Other than that, I think generally I don't have any I think it's better have some good real use case to drive this. Other than that, because we originally devised this kind of thing based on a lot of observation that we have in Alibaba and some open source scenarios, but I still want to see how it use more in production, how people want to use it in production and get some real use case feedback. So
yeah, exactly. So I think Kevin, you may want to also give some examples of your user case, which will help a lot for us to see, okay, what kind of solution we want to have to help you to fix this issue.
So I mean, we're in the same boat as you, right? We're platform team. We're not building. All of our applications are examples. So we don't have a lot of production experience, unfortunately.
Okay.
Now,
yeah.
we do have sort of Sherwood attending now from Oracle, and he's closer to a real user than me. So he might have good opinions about this that he would want to share. But largely, I'd like the same answer as you.
Got it. Right. That I think we want to reach out to the wider community to get some user cases about. In that case, we can decide how we can design this workflow. Depends on actually, honestly speaking, for example, on Alibaba Cloud, there are only a few customers that are using multi-cluster deployment for now. But the trend is maybe, at least from my point of view, that more people will do that in the future.
Yeah. totally agree with that.
Sure. The last thing, this is a minor feature, more like implementation side feature, but may have some relationship with spec, is that we may want to have deployment management. For example, when I deploy a application, then I will actually trigger a deployment, more like a revision, maybe like a revision in a system. So in that case, we can allow user to roll back to check the deployment history or cancel a ongoing deployment. Is this a valid use case in your mind? Or do you think we want to have this defined in the spec, for example, deployment or deployment revisions?
It's certainly a valid use case. I think what we struggle with on our side is that really when you talk about rollout policies, there are just so many options, and every app is potentially unique in what its requirements. So I mean, the danger here is reaching too high and coming up with a solution that nobody wants in the end. It has to do just enough so that it's useful in a variety of ways, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see. Maybe you can just start from the read-only revision first. That will be, just read your deployment history and list it to your users.
Yeah, that's a good place to start.
Okay, yeah. The only item we have is application scope, as Kim mentioned. This is one thing we definitely want to work. So in the existing release, I mean the 0.30 release, we already have a updated version of the scope, but it's exactly same as what we had before. Just change it to a new format to define the application scope. Because we now have a concept of scope definitions pretty similar to trait definitions. In that case, you can define scope like this, just like a trait. It's exactly same with what we propose to define the application scope before by just a GV key right in here. We just give you a way to eliminate the duplicated boilerplate code. So you can just use the definition name, which is, for example, in that case, you have a scope definition with this name, and you write your scope instance name, which is this one. So this is actually the same with what we have right now in V1 2. Just simplified the way you write this reference. This is existing what we have existing design in the OAM spec release. So nothing changed basically. And for the next step, what we want to support, as we already discussed, is the opt-in, opt-out. This is very, very valid use case from my perspective. I think the only issue is what will be the best UI or UX for this workflow, because if you think it deeply, that we want to support both. We want to support both opt-in and opt-out. That will make the UI very interesting. So I will say that let's follow up in this issue about how we can open that, how we can define opt-in and opt-out more naturally. There are already some discussion around this, but it's far from finalized yet. But again, it's more like a UI issue here. This feature we definitely want to support. We also have a issue brought up by Brian, which is also talking about this issue. And I think next step, the direction we're trying to go is that the component will be able to declare opt-in or opt-out to a scope list, which is application label. That is a general idea, but the UI UX really needs some design or discussion.
Plus one to that.
Just a little bit of ignorance here. So what are we opting in or opting out of? What is that we're doing?
So opt-in means that this component, for example, want to join this scope, then it will say, okay, I want to be opt-in in this scope. So it's a way for a component to claim that it want to join a certain scope. And the opt-out is on the other direction. Is like you have a scope that's defined here. So this scope will be applied to all components by default, but the component can say, okay, I want to opt out of this scope. So these two use cases are all valid. So we need to make decisions of which kind of UI or which kind of behavior we want to support, or we even want to support both, which will be more complicated. So that is what is not, I think, not addressed for now. So the existing model is more like opt-in because we define the scope here, but we need to explicitly defining every component to say, okay, I want to join this scope. This is current model actually. But as Kevin mentioned in this issue, that there are a lot of use cases that the scope will be applied to all components. For example, a placement rule, it actually applied to all the components by default, but the component can say, okay, I want to opt out from this scope. So that will be a expected behavior, but the user case will be more complicated if we have multiple scope here. Then as I mentioned, we maybe need to support both. For example, the component will say, I want to opt in the scope A, but opt out from scope B. So the whole workflow, the whole user case is not determined yet. That's what I propose we follow up in this issue to bring up the complete workflow, what we want to support and what we want to avoid, and what is the default behavior. And the scope definition object has already been supported in a existing spec. So now you can define a scope just like a trait.
Yeah, I don't honestly remember what I was trying to say there, what should be in that scope of definition, but I agree that it could be useful.
Yeah, what in this definition, just definition reference. So in that case, we can allow for example, in this case, in this example, that the scope reference will be like a full GVK, right? So if you can leverage the name of the scope definition, you can only use one line to reference this scope definition.
Right, but presumably you could provide some metadata about the scope and its default opt-in versus opt-out kind of, semantic.
Yeah, it indeed have potential to carry the default behavior of the scope. That is really what we're trying to leverage in the scope definition. Right, this is for the application scope. I think the next steps is that we follow up in this issue to raise a concrete design about the behavior of the application scope. This is I think what we must have in next release of the spec. Okay, this is pretty much we have in the agenda. I'm not sure if anyone has other items want to bring up to discuss.
Just the only other thing that I want to make sure that we have something documented for the future is something around component security, that I can provide a component. I'm going to be a component provider, but I want to protect my, intellectual property. So I want to be able to give that to the platform, yet no, you can't access it. So that we should have some security mechanism around components that, really just, I can give you that and not worry that you're gonna kind of break into it.
Are you talking about the accessibility of this component definition or more internal?
The component itself. So I can, somehow say like I encrypt that component and have a way to provide a key on the platform to the component, but really it's just used by the component and there's no way to understand what's happening inside of it. So basically I provide you this component.
Yes.
You have no access to any, like there's somehow I can secure the whole thing and just provide you a couple of pieces of information. And really you have no way to get at it.
I mean, the access rule will be applied to the usage of this component or the details in the components. What kind of information we want to protect?
Right, but I want to secure the actual physical component. So I provide you this code, this component code. I want to secure that in some way. We should have a way that the platform would then understand to be able to gain access to it. So, yeah, I mean, because I guess everybody could just, encrypt the whole thing. Just so that there's some standard way that on the platform you say, this is what by default would be, a good practice for securing your component to protect your intellectual property.
Okay. Could you please also raise the issue to express the idea? I think we really need to have some, detail about.
Yeah, I can kind of show you what
readout.
we're trying to do. Again, more traits around this, but we're basically creating traits so that I have this like weird component that you'd have no idea what it does until I apply a trait, and then the application knows what to do with the component.
Okay. Sure.
But I can explain. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I'll let's follow up
for that as well.
Yeah. Let's follow up in the issue to explain it a little bit. Sounds
Sure.
It's some interesting idea, but I didn't get a full picture of that. Sorry. So maybe some more background.
Okay.
Right. We also do not have a lot of time here, so this is basically want to discuss in this meeting. So the next step includes that we want to finalize the OAM spec release, maybe in this week, possibly, or early next week, by merging the existing pull requests and revisit the whole workflow and documentation. But again, we still have a lot of rooms to improve. They can be shipped to as minor fixes to this release. But I think one thing we want to fix is the persona introduction. We really want to fix that part. This is really important feedback. And after that, we will try to bring up a next release planning, including the feedback and input from you folks in this meeting, as well as collect some feedback from the wider community. That is also one of the next steps. And in this planning issue, we will definitely include the application scope as part of that. Okay, so thank you very much for joining today's OAM Community Call, and really happy to see you in maybe next 2 weeks. And thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.